Right, boys and girls, let's talk about animal welfare and the value of species. Okay, so in chapter 27, even though we've heard little hints about this character Mike Evans before, we know he's the founder of, or the co-founder of the ETO, the Earth Trisolaris organization, and that he is, in modern times, the sort of leader or representative of the Adventist wing of the ETO, the wing that's sort of more interested in using Trisolarans to destroy humanity rather than using Trisolarans as the redemptionists want to improve humanity. Well, in chapter 27, we sort of learn about who this guy is, where he comes from, how he meets Ye-Wen-Ji, and there's an interesting sort of contrast between their two characters, and one of the things that I love about this book so much is how it sort of dramatizes these philosophical differences between these different characters and dramatizes, in that way, the philosophy itself. So, when we meet Evans, he's trying to preserve a particular species, and we also see that he's reading a copy of the philosopher Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. So, we are led to believe that there is some connection between this type of moral philosophy that we see in Singer and a belief in preserving species. Okay. What is that connection? What sorts of philosophical roads or routes could lead you to the conclusion that it's important to preserve species? Does Singer actually lead you to that conclusion? Does Singer lead you to anything like the sort of character that Mike Evans is? These are all questions which we can answer by turning to Singer and turning as well to McCord, a philosopher who addresses, from a different point of view, the question of species in particular. Okay, so Peter Singer, Animal Liberation, you read the first chapter. This is a very, very influential book. It's sort of a Bible for a lot of vegetarians of the 70s. The book starts with this chapter about equality. Okay. Singer, in this chapter, defends what he calls the principle of the equal consideration of interests, which is that morality requires us to take the interests of all creatures seriously, regardless of who they are, how smart they are, whether they're human beings or non-human beings. As long as something has interests, its interests matter just as much as everyone else's interests. Okay. Why would we believe this, and what does this really mean? Okay. Well, I mean, Singer's main reason for believing this is that he thinks that the principle of the equal consideration of interests is the best explanation for, among other things, why we should treat people equally. You know, we all believe in equality. We all say we believe in equality, but it's not at all clear what that actually means, Singer says. On the one hand, it's not true that people are factually equal, right? We're not all literally exactly the same as one another. We differ in all sorts of ways. We differ in appearance. We differ in intelligence. We differ in our sort of natural skills and talents. We differ in our interests. We differ in our religious beliefs, whatever. There are all sorts of differences between people. So people aren't actually all identical. They're not all equal in that sense. Maybe what it means is to say that we have equal rights. Well, okay, but how would that work exactly? It doesn't seem like we all have equal rights, so I have a right to vote, but perhaps a 3-year-old doesn't have a right to vote. Maybe women have a right to an abortion, but I don't have a right to an abortion because I can't get one. Maybe working-age people have a right to a job, but other people don't. Okay, and so on. So, different people seem to have different human rights, and so the idea that equality should be spelled out in terms of us all having exactly the same rights also seems a little fishy. So what Singer says, no, and instead, we should say that people deserve equal consideration of interests. Okay, and furthermore, that this is going to sort of, when people object to this, they'll say, well, yeah, but, animals are different from human beings, so this sort of principle of equality doesn't really apply to them. And you ask, well, how are animals different? You say, well, they're different because they're not as smart. You say, well, actually, a lot of animals are smarter than a lot of non-human animals are smarter than a lot of human beings. Does that mean that we should treat people with severe intellectual disabilities, or treat infants the way that we treat non-human animals typically, that we eat them and so on. I don't think so. Well, people sometimes say, well, animals are sort of outside of our communities of concern. You said, well, what if there was a person who was outside of your community of concern? What if there was a hermit, somebody who lived in the woods, who wasn't a part of society at all? If they were a part of society, does that mean you could do anything you want to them? He said, well, and at some point people just sort of put their foot down and they say, well, animals they're just different species from us. And, you could imagine this is sort of more of a science fiction-y type case, but imagine that some alien comes from outer space and it's exactly as intelligent and is perhaps more intelligent than we are. And it starts talking to you and say, oh, hey, Ian, how's it going? Oh, I'm very curious about what you're up to with this philosophy class, blah, blah, blah. I don't think we would say, oh, well, it's morally permissible for me to eat that alien just because they're a member of another species. Mere membership in another species is not a reason to give anything any kind of unequal consideration. Okay, so Singer says what's going to explain our sort of moral regard for all of the different types of human beings, and for that matter, non-human aliens in that thought experiment. What's going to explain why we should care about all of them and what it means to treat all of them equally is the principle of equal consideration of interests. And the principle of equal consideration of interests also applies to non-human animals. So, the fact that it's what are interests? Interests are, in Singer's view, which he doesn't go into in great detail here, feelings of pleasure or pain, happiness or unhappiness. So if you have some quantity of pain, whatever that quantity is, 5 units of pain, administering that unit to a horse or to a baby is equally bad. It doesn't matter that the baby is a baby. It doesn't matter that the horse is a horse. Pain is pain. Equal quantities of pain are equally bad. Equal quantities of happiness are equally good. How do we quantify happiness? How do we quantify pain? That's a really hard question. Singer doesn't think that there's necessarily going to be an obvious or maybe even any determinate answer at all. But, we can make sort of rough judgments about, what is more painful than what, and so on. So, the principle of equal consideration of interest says, we should, regard equal quantities of pain equally, regardless of who the pain is, who is suffering the pain. Regard equal quantities of happiness equally, regardless of who is enjoying that happiness. Okay. This is one way that you might come to, and that in fact a lot of people have come to, care about non-human animals in ways that sort of violate conventional wisdom. So ordinarily we think we can, the way that people act most of the time, you'd think it's okay to do whatever the fuck you want to animals, right? People eat them, people torture them, people use them for pointless cosmetic experiments. I want to test some new brand of laundry detergent for the 5,000th time. Why didn't I pour it down the throat of some rabbit or rat? People use non-human animals in ways that often reflect a complete disregard for, a complete failure to take into account their interests. Okay. So this is one sort of route into caring about their interests and, reforming our behavior towards and our attitudes towards non-human animals. Let's turn to McCord, and then we'll turn back to Singer and do a little compare and contrast. Okay. McCord isn't so much concerned with how we treat individual animals. McCord is interested in how we relate to other species of animals. And in fact, in this way, he's a lot like a lot of conservationists or environmentalists. When you hear about, save the whales or save the dolphins or save the manatees or whatever, people aren't so much interested in protecting the interests of any one manatee or, frankly, protecting the interests of any group of manatees. They want to preserve whole species. And, if you think about it, this is a little strange. Why should we care about species at all? Species don't have interests. Individual creatures have interests. Okay. McCord gives a couple of reasons. he says, well, first of all, we care about non-human species because of the medical and financial and technological benefits that we get out of them. So, we might raise a species of animal as pets, or to sell to zoos or aquariums or something like that. Or we might use them for, we might harvest their organs for medicine or for some cosmetic product or something like that. We can make money off of animals, and we can benefit ourselves from animals. But McCord says that's not the only way. He's looking for a way of valuing species that sort of isn't about us. It's about them. And he says, okay, well, there are two ways of doing this. At least two reasons why we might value other species sort of for their own sake. One is that there's a kind of, each species represents a branch of the tree of life. And the tree of life on planet Earth goes back billions of years. And so there's this genealogy for any species on Earth today. It represents a kind of endpoint of the tree of life, a branch on the tree of life that you can trace back to its very roots, back to the origins of life. And, there's a kind of, there's sort of something, in some sense, objectively sort of sad or ugly or awful or displeasing about cutting off a branch of the tree of life. The tree of life is a beautiful thing, and it needs to be maintained, if only for perhaps aesthetic reasons. So there's this kind of aesthetic appreciation that you can have of the tree of life, and we think that for a species to go extinct is to fail to respect that aesthetic value. Okay, another thing you could say is that species have evolved to solve all sorts of problems that they've encountered in their evolutionary past. So he gives the example of the pronghorn, which is a species of some kind of deer-like thing, which can run really, really fucking fast. And it no longer has any very fast predators, so it's sort of not obvious why it should be able to run so fast. It has to burn a lot of calories to run so fast. So, why would it spend all this energy? And the answer is, well, a few thousand years ago, its ancestral predators, the predators that used to hunt it, were also very fast. And so the pronghorn outlived all of its ancestors. Ancestral predators. The ancestral predators are all extinct, but the pronghorn is still around, and because of its inheritance, it's still really fast. So, so we can learn from species about the various ways of solving evolutionary challenges, and we can learn, of course, about their sort of unique evolutionary histories as long as they stick around. They're like books in a library, but when the species goes extinct, the book is burnt. We are sort of closed off from learning, at least in a certain way or to a certain degree of specificity, about the thing's evolutionary history. Okay, so these are two reasons for McCord why we might care about valuing species. How do Singer and McCord compare and contrast? Well, Singer doesn't talk about valuing species at all. He does talk about speciesism, which is, on analogy with racism or sexism or ableism, is a discrimination against some creature because of its membership in a species. But that's not the same as caring about the species itself or preserving the species itself. Singer might say, well, we need to preserve species because of it would hurt the creatures that make up the species for it to go extinct, or it would hurt the creatures that share an ecosystem with that species for it to go extinct. But there's no, so to speak, intrinsic reason to care about species. There's a sense in which, I think, from Singer's point of view, the typical environmentalist or conservationist concern with preserving species is a little misguided, that we should probably be more concerned with preserving the interests of individual creatures, even if they're members of very populous species. There are billions of chickens on planet Earth. Chickens aren't going away anytime soon as a species, or whatever jungle fowl aren't going away anytime soon as a species. We still need to care about their interests. McCord. I think from Singer's point of view, there might be some reasons to care about preserving species, but they're all sort of extrinsic or contingent. They don't care. They don't come from sort of caring about the species itself for its own sake. They come from caring about individuals and their happiness and unhappiness. McCord is different. McCord is different. He thinks regardless of whether it has nothing to do with happiness or unhappiness, it's not a, as philosophers say, utilitarian thing. It's about caring about the species itself and the sort of it's for aesthetic reasons and for, we might say, epistemic reasons, because of what we can learn from it. One way that this contrast comes out is that McCord, I think, would say that we should care about preserving species of things that don't have interests at all, right? So maybe some plant that's incapable of having any sort of feelings, or some species of bacteria or something like that. McCord could say, yeah, we should care about these things because they represent a certain branch of the tree of life, and it would be sort of objectively, aesthetically unpleasing or awful, or a failure to respect the aesthetic value of the tree of life to let this species go extinct, and also because we can learn from it. And this applies whether the species has any feelings or interests at all, right? So some species of plant, it solved the challenges that it faced in its evolutionary history. It's its own branch of the tree of life, and so on. Okay, so there's a contrast between Singer and McCord, and one question to ask is, does, with respect to the three-body problem, does Evans represent sort of more of a McCord-like thinker or a Singer-type thinker? And for that matter, does Evans, as an Adventist, as somebody who eventually reaches the conclusion that the world would be better off without human beings at all because of how awful human beings have been to other species, does Evans sort of follow through on or live according to the values that Singer and Evans, that Singer and McCord defend? Or does he have some other system of values or no system of values at all? Or does he somehow misapply or misinterpret or screw up the application of Singer's or McCord's principles? That is a question you will have to ask yourself. And on that note, good work.